तो वो फिर आप ठीक नहीं कर सकते। इंटरनेशनल वाटर्स पल्यूट हो गए फुल फ्लेजेडली तो फिर कुछ नहीं हो सकता। फिर बैठे रहेंगे हम, सदियों तक बैठे रहेंगे इस इंतजार में कि ये नेचुरली साफ होंगे तब इनका इस्तेमाल होगा। दैट इज नॉट। Hello, students, and welcome to another lecture. And the topic of this lecture is obligations of United Nations Convention on the Law of Seas parties to confront climate change. United Nations Convention on the Law of Seas is a convention to which many countries are parties. They have signed this convention and they have ratified this convention over a period of time, and they have become parties to this convention in order to make sure that the laws relating to the international waters, they are followed and obliged. So all these parties together, by virtue of this convention, have also established an international tribunal for the law of the seas. Now, the question is that what are the obligations? Because when it comes to climate change, every ecosystem, whether it's water ecosystem or air ecosystem or any other ecosystem, is involved equally in the process of climate change. And climate change is not a national challenge for any particular country, but rather it is an international challenge for all the countries of the world. This is something which is not limited by the boundaries. This is not something which is happening only in India or in Pakistan or in China or in USA. This is happening everywhere, because the smokes, the pollutions, the greenhouse gas emissions which are which are being emitted out through industries and various sources, they are not themselves territorial boundaries. They are going far and beyond, and they are creating a fuss around the globe. So in that case, obligations of these parties who are parties to the United Nations Convention on the Law of Seas, how to confront the climate change. Because what the recently the International Tribunal on 21st May 2024, this tribunal, International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, see, this International Tribunal for the Law of the Seas delivers unanimous advisory opinion on obligations of UNSCLOS parties to confront climate change. Now, this has delivered a unanimous advisory opinion. Advisory opinion means you must have understood in previous lectures and other lectures of other teachers also, that you must have come across what is an advisory jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. We have it in our Constitution of India also. Advisory jurisdiction, it is not something limited to the Constitution of India, but it is a general universal law which is applicable across all the democracies of the world. So advisory opinion is something that advisory opinion or advisory jurisdiction is something when an advice or an opinion is sought from the court, from the judiciary. Okay, like the President of India, in our constitution, the process is the President of India seeks a legal opinion or advice from the Supreme Court, which is treated as a full-fledged petition by the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court delivers a full-fledged judgment in the form of this opinion comes in the form of a full-fledged judgment. Okay, so this is an advisory opinion on the obligations of state parties to the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas concerning climate change. The opinion addressed two interconnected questions. There were two basic challenges, two very basic questions before the tribunal. What were they? One, the specific obligations of UNCLOS parties to prevent, reduce, and control pollution of the marine environment caused by greenhouse gas emissions. See, greenhouse gas emissions, they are polluting the air. There is no doubt about it. But greenhouse gas emissions, they are also polluting the marine ecosystem. They are polluting the waters. They're polluting the international waters. And when the 75% of Earth is already covered by water, and which is the biggest source for all, for the entire world, because the entire world dwells upon its necessity for water on on international waters. And when these international waters, they come to get polluted, that was the biggest question, that the greenhouse gas emissions are polluting the marine ecosystems. And what was the second question? B, the specific obligations of these parties to protect and preserve the marine environment in relation to climate change impacts, including ocean warming, sea level rise, and ocean acidification. It's not only greenhouse gas emissions, but other things also. And what are the other things? Climate change impacts, industrial uh, there are industrial discharges into the water bodies. For example, what happens that industrial discharges are made into the rivers. In every country, this happens. In India, if we take the example of India, we see that there are industries, and industries, they discharge their waste into nearby water bodies, and these water bodies, they subsequently flow into rivers, and these rivers then subsequently flow into or merges into some uh, international water body or in sea. Like you can see that rivers like uh, Tapi and Sabarmati, they flow into Arabian Sea. There are rivers like Kaveri, Godavari, they flow into Bay of Bengal. Ganga flows into the Bay of Bengal. Yamuna flows into the Bay of Bengal, and they pass through most industrial regions of the country, like Kanpur, which is a heavy industrial area. Like we can say Muradabad. Muradabad has a tributary of Ganga, okay, which is polluted again because of excessive industrial agglomerations present there in the city. So they pass through the most industrial, dense industrial regions of the country, and they eventually flow into the Bay of Bengal. So finally and eventually, what is getting polluted? International marine ecosystem is getting polluted. So these are climate change impacts. Ocean warming, obviously, the because of excessive smoke release, because of excessive vehicular pollution in the countries, because of excessive deforestation, because of excessive industrial smokes, because of excessive use of refrigerators and air conditioners, which release CFCs or chlorofluorocarbons in the environment, they are eventually warming the environment. And what is happening? It is leading to global warming, which is eventually leading to ocean warming. And ocean warming is recorded by way when the glaciers, they start melting. And when the glaciers start melting, what happens? There is a sea level rise. The sea level rise is dangerous. And ocean acidification, obviously, when industrial discharges are being made into their water bodies, then definitely the acidification is quite but natural. Okay, so on the first question, in focusing on the ocean as a natural carbon sink, the ITLOS, the International Tribunal, concluded that GHG emissions constitute pollution of the marine environment and thus trigger state obligations under this convention. The tribunal observed that parties' obligations with respect to pollution from GHG emissions are not discharged by participation in climate change instruments such as the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement. This is a very recent development. UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was a framework convention which was perhaps designed way back in 2012. And under this umbrella framework, there was Paris Agreement which was agreed upon or which was entered upon in 2016 in Paris. And this Paris Agreement was one of the biggest milestone in the field of climate change by the international community, because this Paris Agreement decided that all the countries of the world are going to present a report card of themselves, what they have done so far in the whole year in order to reduce the GHG emissions and to address this issue of climate change. So GHG emissions, mm, Paris or this UNFCCC and Paris Agreement, rather this United Nations Convention on Law of Seas parties are required to take all necessary measures. So whichever countries they are parties to the Convention on the Law of the Seas, they are equally responsible to the Paris Agreement as well. Whatever was agreed upon in the Paris Agreement has to be followed by the parties to the UNCLOS as well. It's not that we are party to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, but we are not a party to the Paris Agreement, and hence we are not going to follow what was decided in Paris Agreement. No, because you are a party to the UNCLOS, then definitely you are supposed to act upon what was agreed upon in the Paris Agreement. Okay, then this is the finding of the tribunal, that you have to require to take all necessary measures, including individual actions as appropriate, to prevent, reduce, and control marine pollution from GHG emissions, as well as endeavor to harmonize the policies in that regard. see, individual actions. What are individual actions? Climate change is not something that United Nations alone will be able to handle. All the countries will have to make a concerted effort in order to address this issue. And in order to address this issue, what these countries have to do, they are given national targets. Okay, they are given national targets, and those national targets are that every country, according to its own pollution levels, have to bring down a certain level of carbon emissions on an yearly basis. And once that is done, it has to produce its report card to the United Nations and to the countries that we have reduced this much of emissions by 2024, and then by 2030 we have this much of like obligation that we have to bring about from bring down the global temperature from 1.5 degrees Celsius to 2 degrees Celsius. So these are some of the individual actions. Then uh, such necessary measures must be balanced with other rights, including navigational rights, while various factors must be considered in an objective assessment. Among the factors to consider in an objective assessment, the ITLOS noted the importance of science, other international rules and standards relating to climate change, and the capabilities of the state concerned. Underscoring that science is a particularly relevant factor, the International Tribunal attached significant weight to reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. In the absence of scientific certainty, the International Tribunal underscored that the precautionary approach must be applied. See, in case okay, it's let's not get into the scientific experiments. The tribunal says like science is very important. A scientific approach is very important in order to understand the science of pollution. But let's not get into the deep into the subject of science, and let's underscore the precautionary principle approach. Precautionary principle is that you have to undertake certain precautions before doing something. So in order to precautionary approach is all right, and that is going to bring down the pollution levels to a pollution levels to a great degree. The ITLOS observed that the obligation to combat pollution under Article 194 of United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas is a best efforts obligation of conduct subject to a due diligence standard. Due diligence, in return, requires a state to put in place a national system, including legislation, administrative procedures, and an enforcement mechanism necessary to regulate the activities in question, and to exercise adequate vigilance to make such a system function efficiently with a view to achieving the intended objective. This is the definition of, I must underline this, uh, what is subject to diligence. The tribunal says that this must be subjected to due diligence. Now, what is that? Article 194 of United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas is best efforts obligation of conduct subject to due diligence standard. Due diligence in turn requires state to put in place a national system. Every state has to put a national system. That's what I told you. Individual actions are necessary. Without individual actions, it is not possible. National system, including legislation. Every country has to legislate laws relating to environment. Like, for example, India has already legislated far back in 1986 after the Bhopal gas tragedy that took unfolded unfortunately in 1984. Uh, After that, the Indian government had legislated an umbrella legislation called Environment Protection Act 1986. And it was followed by many other laws like the Air Act, the Water Act, the Noise Pollution Control Rules, and Biodiversity Act 2002. So all these legislation is very important. Then administrative procedures and an enforcement mechanism necessary. Administrative procedures, for example, if example, this is not just limit, these administrative procedure definition is not limited to my example. I'm just giving an example in order to make you understand what is the kind of administrative procedure is. Like, for example, if I'm an industrialist and I want to establish an industry. Now, while I want to establish an industry, I will first have to seek permission and environmental clearance from the Environment Ministry. And these are some of the environmental procedures. And these environmental procedures are important because these kinds of environmental clearances, obtaining environmental clearances, they're part of administrative procedures and an enforcement mechanism necessary to regulate the activities in question and to exercise adequate vigilance to make such a system function efficiently with a view to achieving the intended objective. What is the objective? Intended objective is to bring down the pollution levels, right? Intended objective के पीछे क्या करना है? To regulate the activities in question, whatever activities are taking place. Okay, देखिए for example Environment Protection Act में ये है कि जो स्टेट है वो इंडस्ट्रीज का मुआयना करेगी, सुपरवाइज करेगी टाइम टू टाइम, देखेगी कि जो उनके एमिशंस हैं वो लेजिस्लेटिव लिमिट्स के अंदर हैं या वो लिमिट्स को पार कर रहे हैं। अगर पार करें तो उनके ऊपर फाइन लगाएगी, उनके ऊपर पाबंदी लगाएगी कि जो भी आपने लॉस किया है एनवायरनमेंट को, अब आप उसको कंपनसेट करिए। ये सारी बातें जो होती हैं ये रेगुलेट द एक्टिविटीज वाले क्वेश्चन में आएंगी, एंड टू एक्सरसाइज एडिक्वेट विजिलेंस टू मेक सच अ सिस्टम फंक्शन एफिशिएंटली। यही वाला एग्जांपल है कि सारे इंडस्ट्रीज का मायना होता है। नॉइस पोल्यूशन कंट्रोल रूल्स में आप देखें, नॉइस पोल्यूशन कंट्रोल रूल्स में ऐसा होता है कि अगर आपने इतने डेसिबल से इतने पर्टिकुलर डेसिबल से हाई नॉइज आप यूज नहीं कर सकते, गाड़ी के हॉर्न्स इतने डेसिबल्स के होने चाहिए, और नॉइज सिस्टम आप 10 बजे के बाद नहीं यूज कर सकते। Some of the things like system function efficiently with a view to achieving the intended objective. The tribunal emphasized that due diligence should not be understood as an obligation which depends largely on the discretion of a state or necessarily requires a lesser degree of effort to achieve the intended result. Rather, the due diligence must be determined objectively, considering relevant factors and circumstances, while the obligation may be a demanding one. See, it is not something which is which is at the discretion of the state. द ट्राइब्यूनल सेज कि ये आपकी मर्जी पे नहीं चलेगा कि आपकी मर्जी हुई, आपके स्टेट है, हम इंडिया है, हम पाकिस्तान, हम चाइना, हम यूएसए हैं, हम रवांडा है, हम कुछ भी हैं, और हमारी जो है वो मर्जी चल रही है कि हमारी डिस्क्रिप्शन पर है कि हम हमारी मर्जी होगी तो हम करेंगे। ऐसा नहीं है। इफ यू आर अ पार्टी टू इट, यू हैव टू डू इट, एंड it has to be determined objectively. It has to be determined objectively, considering relevant factors and circumstances, while the obligation may be a demanding one. As regards pollution from GHG emissions, the tribunal opined that the standard of due diligence must be stringent given the high risk of serious and irreversible harm to the marine environment. देखिए, बहुत ज्यादा स्ट्रिक्ट होना चाहिए ये मसला। ये कोई ऐसा वैसा नहीं कि डिस्क्रिप्शन पे छोड़ दिया और एकदम लीनियंसी कर दी कंट्रीज के साथ कि ठीक है आप देख लीजिए जैसा आपको ठीक लगे। ऐसा कुछ नहीं है। स्ट्रिक्ट होना चाहिए। ट्राइब्यूनल कह रहा है स्ट्रिक्ट होना चाहिए आपको, क्योंकि इसमें जो आपने लॉस कॉज कर दिया वो फिर ठीक नहीं होने वाला। ये तो सब बातें हैं कि आप इसको कंपनसेट करेंगे, कैसे कंपनसेट करेंगे, कैसे हो पाएगा? कोविड के ही टाइम ये पॉसिबल हो पाया था कि नेचुरल इकोसिस्टम जो थे वो अपने नेचुरल लेवल्स के ऊपर आ गए थे ऑटोमेटिकली, क्योंकि सब घरों में बैठे हुए थे इतने टाइम तक। कोई व्हीकुलर पोल्यूशन नहीं था, कोई इंडस्ट्रीज काम नहीं कर रही थी, कुछ भी नहीं हो रहा था, राइट? तभी ये पॉसिबल हुआ था। रिवर्स साफ हो गई थी अपने आप। तो ये नेचुरल चीज है, लेकिन जब ह्यूमन एक्टिविटीज होंगी तो पॉसिबल नहीं है कि ये सब हो पाए। तो डिमांड ये है कि रिस्क ऑफ सीरियस एंड इरिवर्सिबल हार्म टू द मरीन एनवायरनमेंट। एक बार आपने पानी गंदा कर दिया तो वो फिर आप ठीक नहीं कर सकते। इंटरनेशनल वाटर्स पॉल्यूट हो गए फुल फ्लेजेडली तो फिर कुछ नहीं हो सकता। फिर बैठे रहेंगे हम, सदियों तक बैठे रहेंगे इस इंतजार में कि ये नेचुरली साफ होंगे तब इनका इस्तेमाल होगा। दैट इज नॉट पॉसिबल। ओके, then comes, in recognizing the obligation of this convention parties to confront transboundary pollution from GHG emissions, the tribunal acknowledged the inherent challenge in establishing causation. Okay, now coming to this part, that tribunal ने parties के obligation को कैसे outline किया है? Obligation to legislate, implement, and enforce rules in the context of GHG emissions. In particular, the convention parties must give due consideration in good faith to international norms under climate change instruments. State parties must also cooperate in good faith, either directly or through competent international organizations. This obligation, as per the tribunal must be assessed by reference to the efforts made by states to formulate and elaborate international rules, standards and recommended practices and procedures. देखिए इसमें जो रिपोर्ट कार्ड तैयार होगा ना हर स्टेट का, वो ऐसे नहीं तैयार होगा कि हमने ये देखा कि हमने आपने ठीक है लेजिस्लेशन बना दिया, ये कर दिया, ये कर दिया, ये कर दिया, ऐसे नहीं होगा. दिस ऑब्लिगेशन में ट्राइब्यूनल कह रहा है बाय रेफरेंस टू द एफर्ट्स मेड बाय स्टेट टू फॉर्मुलेट एंड इलैबोरेट इंटरनेशनल रूल्स. किस हद तक आपने इंटरनेशनल रूल्स को अपने लेजिस्लेशंस में, डोमेस्टिक लेजिस्लेशंस में इनकॉर्पोरेट किया, उनको एनफोर्स किया, उनको इंप्लीमेंट किया, उसके ऊपर अमल किया. ठीक है. स्टैंडर्ड्स एंड रिकमेंडेड प्रैक्टिसेस एंड प्रोसीजर्स, जो रिकमेंड किया था आपको प्रैक्टिसेस एंड प्रोसीजर्स, वेदर यू फॉलोड इट और यू डिड नॉट. In the context of the prevention, reduction, and control of pollution of the marine environment, the tribunal highlighted the obligation of convention parties to provide appropriate technical assistance to developing countries, particularly those vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change, including when acting through other competent international organizations of which assisting states are members. Okay, now this International Tribunal added that convention parties must monitor the risk or effects of marine environment pollution, publish reports, and conduct environmental impact assessments. This is very important. Environmental impact assessments. अभी मैंने आपके सामने environmental clearance की बात करी थी. Environmental clearance बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट होता है. एनवायरमेंटल इम्पैक्ट असेसमेंट होता है हर इंडस्ट्री का, हर चीज का जो पोल्यूशन करती है उसका एक ईआईए होता है. और ईआईए इंपॉर्टेंट है टू अंडरस्टैंड के ये इंडस्ट्री स्टैब्लिश हो सकती है या नहीं हो सकती है. अ स्टेट्स डिस्क्रिशन इन डिसाइडिंग वेदर टू कंडक्ट एन ईआईए, अ रिक्वायरमेंट ऑफ कस्टमरी इंटरनेशनल लॉ. दिस इज अ कस्टमरी इंटरनेशनल लॉ. कस्टमरी मींस which is in practice, which is in practice, a practice long established, a practice long established. कस्टमरी ये कहीं लिखा हुआ नहीं है, लेकिन ये प्रैक्टिस होता चला आया है. एनवायरमेंटल इम्पैक्ट असेसमेंट was limited by the requirement to determine whether an activity under the state's jurisdiction or control may cause substantial pollution of or significant and harmful changes to the marine environment. Such evaluation is an objective determination based on facts and scientific knowledge and needs to consider potential pollution changes and consider the cumulative impacts of parties. On the second question, now this is the last part. On the second question, the International Tribunal observed that the obligation under Article 192 of the Convention to protect and preserve the marine environment can be invoked to combat any form of environmental degradation, including the impacts of climate change such as ocean warming, sea level rise, and ocean acidification. ओके तो इसमें हर चीज आती है. 194 में खाली ये नहीं कि सिर्फ जीएचजी एमिशंस ही पर कंट्रोल किया जाएगा, बल्कि एनवायरमेंटल डिग्रेडेशन पर भी किया जाएगा और बाकी चीजों पे भी किया जाएगा. फॉर द ITLOS, द टर्म प्रिजर्वेशन इंक्लूडिंग रेस्टोरेशन, मीनिंग दैट द ऑब्लिगेशन encompasses restoring degraded marine habitats and ecosystems. Okay, then lastly, the tribunal noted the increased implementation of area-based management tools, including the marine protected areas. हर एरिया को एक डिजिग्नेट कर दिया गया कि मरीन प्रोटेक्टेड एरियाज हैं, ये बहुत ही नेचुरली रिच हैं, इनको आप छेड़ नहीं सकते, यहाँ पर आप कोई भी ह्यूमन एक्टिविटी नहीं कर सकते जिससे पोल्यूशन होगा. ओके, विद इन एंड बियॉन्ड नेशनल ज्यूरिसडिक्शन. सो एरिया बेस्ड मैनेजमेंट. ऐसे ही एनवायरमेंट इकोलॉजिकली सेंसिटिव एरियाज डिजिग्नेट कर दिए जाते हैं मिनिस्ट्रीज की तरफ से कि यहाँ पर ना कोई कंस्ट्रक्शन होगा, ना माइनिंग होगी, ना खुदाई होगी, ना ये होगा, ना वो होगा, कुछ भी नहीं होगा, ये एज इट इज रहेगा. जैसे वेस्टर्न घाट्स है इंडिया में, 8,000 किलोमीटर के करीब आसपास जो है वो पूरा एरिया डिक्लेयर कर दिया है मिनिस्ट्री ऑफ एनवायरमेंट ने एज इकोलॉजिकली सेंसिटिव एरिया. तो वहां कोई ह्यूमन एक्टिविटी नहीं है, इकोनॉमिक एक्टिविटी नहीं हो सकती. ऐसे यहाँ पर मरीन प्रोटेक्टेड एरियाज कर दें नेशनल ज्यूरिसडिक्शंस के अंदर, तो उससे क्या होगा कि मरीन इकोसिस्टम हम बचा सकते हैं. सो दैट इज ऑल अबाउट द फाइंडिंग्स ऑफ द इंटरनेशनल ट्राइब्यूनल, a recent finding of the International Tribunal on the Law of the Seas. Thank you.